Class is now in session. I'm Professor Hockey, and today we'll be discussing Game 13 of the regular season for the San Jose Sharks. They took on the Detroit Red Wings and lost by a score of 3-2 in the shootout. Now, the Sharks, they failed to capture the ever-elusive 3-game winning streak. They have not had too many of those over the past few seasons, but it would have been nice to get one early on this year. Not the case, however, as while the Sharks do earn 1 point, the extra point goes the way of Detroit in the skills competition. The Red Wings have not been a particularly great team historically, at least in recent history, I should say, as their playoff drought, I believe, is actually longer than the Sharks' current playoff drought is. And if you go back to last season, San Jose actually completed the season series sweep over Detroit 2-0. However, this year, the Red Wings have started much, much better. They have had a great start to the year. They have a heavy winning record. And so what this ended up being was just another great opponent, the Sharks, to face off against. A few days ago, it was New Jersey. Yesterday was Colorado. And today it is Detroit. This was the second half of a back-to-back, as well as the final game of a 5 games and 8-day stretch, so perhaps fatigue does end up playing a factor here, as the Sharks do not look particularly great in this one. Now, in the first period, it was maybe a little bit of fatigue from the Red Wings as well, as they are nearing the end of a West Coast road trip, and so not much actually gets done in the first 20 minutes of this game. A couple of chances either way, maybe, but a scoreless game after 20 minutes. In the second period, however, the Detroit Red Wings do begin to wake up a little bit. They start to pressure the Sharks defense on the forecheck. They get some good rush chances, and eventually it is a fantastic shot from Lucas Raymond that makes it 1-0 Detroit, and that is the score after 40 minutes. In the third period, Jeff Skinner scores early on. That ties the game up at 1, but then with about 10 minutes to go in the game, it is Moritz Seider with his first of the season. That gives the Red Wings back the lead, and at this point, with how the Sharks had been playing, it was maybe expected that it would just kind of end without that game-tying goal and it would be a regulation loss, but it is Sam Dickinson in his 10th game of the season, which is notable. I'll get to that a little bit later, and he scores his first career goal. That ties the game up at 2, and we head to the overtime, where we have seen thus far this season, at least over the last few overtimes, that the Sharks have had a lot of success in. They've managed to pick up a bunch of wins as recently as just yesterday against Colorado. However, here tonight, the overtime passes without any goals being scored either way, which is something that I do want to bring up here, because what we saw in this overtime is what we see in pretty much every single overtime, which is that possession is king. Teams know that they want to hold on to the puck as long as possible, and so what this ends up leading to is teams having the puck in the offensive zone, and if they don't find that right opening for themselves, they'll exit the zone, they'll get a change up, and they'll re-enter, forcing the other team, because it is the long change, to have to stay on the ice, get a little bit tired, and see if that opening now will get created because of the tired defensive players on the ice. And so what we saw in this game from Detroit, for instance, was that there was a full 2 or so minutes of just strictly possession for the Red Wings that led to 0 shots or even shot attempts, as it was finally interrupted in the end by a San Jose Sharks, or a giveaway to the San Jose Sharks. And this is just kind of against the spirit of the overtime. I think the 3-on-3, the reason it even came into existence in the first place was to try and create more open space so that we could have crazy back and forth games, 2-on-1, then breakaway back the other way, amazing saves, amazing chances. This always leads to the most memorable overtimes, not this type of hold on to the puck, wait for your opportunity. That's just not particularly interesting. And so, considering this is the optimal way that teams have figured out how to play, they're not going to stop doing this unless they are forced to stop doing this, which means I would say the NHL does need to step in. It has been this way for years, so I don't know if it's actually going to happen, but a rule change I feel should be made to try and create a little bit more fun into the overtime. As much as, the shootout is exciting somewhat, and it is a better alternative than having games end in a complete tie, I feel as though the overtime is much more preferred to that, and so I'd like to see more games end in this 5-minute period. Now, what rule change could they make? Well, we have seen the NHL try to do things in the past to create an increased level of scoring. For instance, a few years ago, you could always not change players after an icing, but you could take a timeout to let them rest. That is no longer the case. No more timeout on icing, so we know that the NHL is willing to do something like this. One thing that they could try to do is actually not have the teams switch sides in the overtime, because right now, when you're on the defensive team, you have the long change, so it's very difficult to get players off of the ice, and that's why teams can actually exit the zone. But if you don't switch sides and you actually have the short change that you have in the third period, well, you wouldn't be as willing to do this, because teams could just make that quick change onto the bench and you would not have accomplished much of anything. So that's one thing. You could institute a shot clock. There are multiple different rules that could be made here. Try to make this overtime a little bit more exciting, because it is the back and forth that people want to see. It is not the possession is king type of perspective. Then the shootout does come around. As I said, the Red Wings do pull out the victory here. The Sharks, they had 4 shooters. None of them managed to score. It is only JVR for the Red Wings that is able to put the puck in the net, and that does it for the game. Moving on to the players to talk about before we actually get into the lineup here tonight, there is one kind of aside that I want to make, which I think is very important to mention even before we get to this particular player, and that is going to be that the word of the day for this video is confidence. It is such an important factor in a player playing well on a consistent basis. A good player with confidence will actually be able to outperform a great player who's not feeling too hot about themselves. And so it is incredibly, incredibly important for a player to be able to capture that and keep it for an extended period of time. And this is not only the case for younger players, where this is where it's usually talked about, but even for some more veteran guys. A good example of this from a Sharks perspective is Alex Wennberg, who had not a very good start at all to this season. He was definitely struggling to begin, staying on that second line, and while I wouldn't say his spot was in jeopardy there, because Ryan Warsofsky is a huge fan of Wennberg, and so he'd keep him in that role for as long as possible, it was a position where he wasn't fully deserving of it because of the lack of offense that he was actually able to generate back at the beginning of that year. It wasn't that he was snake-bitten or that he was unlucky, he just wasn't actually managing to accomplish much of anything. However, recently, he had that game against the Los Angeles Kings where he managed to break through, he scored that goal, he had a fantastic assist, and since then, his confidence level has been very high, and he's been able to follow that up with an incredible game where he was one of the Sharks' best players against the New Jersey Devils, a pretty good outing just yesterday where he was tasked with shutting down players like Nathan MacKinnon and Martin Necas on a pretty consistent basis throughout, and I didn't think he was all that bad here tonight against the Detroit Red Wings either. And so it is a very kind of crystal clear difference between Wennberg over these last 4 games compared to Wennberg back at the beginning of the season, and that is because he has now had that confidence put into him because of those good performances that he was able to have against the Los Angeles Kings, against New Jersey. So he's definitely rolling at this point, and the reason I bring this up is because it is very, very notable with a player like Sam Dickinson here tonight. That was kind of the big storyline for this player, because coming into this game, it was his 10th of the season, and that means that he has now burned a year off of his entry-level contract. It is important to mention that this is not a guarantee that he will remain with the Sharks for the entire year. There's no saying whether or not he'll still be with the team by the time the season concludes in mid-April, but it does mean that at least in the short term, for the next month or the next couple of months, he will remain with San Jose, because if they were going to send him down, they would have done so before that contract actually got burned off. And so what we have seen from Dickinson in this game because of this is an immense amount of pressure actually lifted off of his shoulders, where he doesn't have that insane watchful eye over his shoulder 24/7 where he has to constantly check for it, where he feels as though one mistake and he's going to be on the next plane back to London. He can actually go out there and play his game a little bit more. He's given the vote of confidence from the coaching staff, from Mike Greer, the general manager, that he belongs here at the NHL level, and you could see that immediately in this game. Like, his goal was obviously impressive, but it came in the last few minutes of the third period. Prior to that, he was still playing very well. He was the Sharks' best defenseman of the night. This was likely his best game of the entire season, and we were seeing the big confidence plays coming out from him. Because over the first 9 games, Dickinson has not played poorly, right? He's had a couple of rough games, but he's usually been rather solid. But the big thing that Dickinson has been focused on is kind of trying to get his game under control in the defensive zone, and some could say that that is absolutely smart, but the thing is, with a player who is drafted, or a defenseman who is drafted 11th overall, you're not just okay with having a guy who's pretty good in his own zone. You want someone who's actually going to be able to bring that two-way style of game, and that was what was advertised here with Sam Dickinson. He may not have had the highest ceiling of all of the offensive defensemen, but that he could still put up points, and we saw that from him last year when he was the OHL defenseman of the entire season. He set a franchise record for points with the London Knights. Incredible year, but it just had started off very slowly offensively, and it was because, or perhaps because I should say, obviously I can't know for sure, because of that lack of confidence that he had in himself. I don't think that was better on display than in the game against the Minnesota Wild, where he had a pretty rough night, but it wasn't because he was making incorrect decisions, but it was just because his play with the puck was very shaky, gripping his stick too tightly, not making great passes, and so it led to multiple mistakes in that one. But here, so much more freedom to just kind of go out and play his game, and we saw that quickly on display. In previous games when he would attempt to join the rush, because we we did see it rather rarely, he would always abandon it very, very fast the moment things would turn sideways to try and get back into defensive positioning. That is not an incorrect call, but it is obviously very, very safe, and sometimes you want to see your offensive or two-way guys take a little bit more risk. As well, in previous games, we would see him sit behind the net, look to make a play, and then just end up with a simple pass to his defensive partner, or with a forward who's just a few feet away. Again, not incorrect, but there's nothing really exciting there. But this game, we saw him joining the rush, actually getting in on the forecheck. There was one particular shift when he was on the ice with Giles and Goodrow, and he was actually in there along the wall with them for multiple seconds, trying to make something happen. We saw him behind the net actually use the open ice in front of him, skating into it to try and create some actual lanes and some actual plays to be made using that skating ability. And so a lot of confidence being shown by Sam Dickinson, and as such, it really wasn't that much of a surprise when he did claim his first goal of the entire year later on in the third period. It felt as though we were kind of building towards that as this game went on because of how well he was playing. And this just goes to show that sometimes, sort of like unlocking the chains and allowing a player, especially a really skilled, talented young player, to just go out and try their best and have some fun and see what happens. Sometimes that is just the correct move. For instance, last year with Macklin Celebrini, obviously, Celebrini and Dickinson not on the same wavelength in terms of player. Celebrini is truly something else, but he was not scratched a single game. There was never any harsh consequences given to Celebrini, no matter what ended up happening. And while he was fantastic last year, there were still mistakes being made. There were still weaknesses in his game. I've brought it up many, many times. The puck management absolutely was not there for Celebrini. Last year, amongst all forwards, he led the entire league in giveaways per 60 minutes. And so there were times where he was the reason why the Sharks would end up giving up a goal. But the Sharks gave him the space to learn from this. They gave him the space to improve from this. And coming into this season, he looks significantly better in this area. His giveaways per 60 minutes dropped by more than one. And that might not sound like a ton, but this now has him, instead of being first in the forwards across the entire league, to now being 99th in forwards across the entire league for those who have played at least 5 games. That is a good bit less than where he was at in the previous season. Now, for a player like Celebrini who touches the puck so often, you expect him to give the puck up more often than others, but you don't want to be that number one guy. And now he currently finds himself below players like Mitch Marner, Austin Matthews, Mark Scheifele, who leads the league in terms of points. And so this is significantly more respectable. And so for Sam Dickinson, who has been having that very, very kind of strict set of rules seemingly in the first 9 games and hasn't really been able to deviate much from that, now that this pressure is off, now that he knows he's sticking around, now that he's given a little bit more space, we can see what that confidence is doing for him. And this connects exactly to another lineup decision that the San Jose Sharks made tonight, because as you can see here, no, I did not forget a forward in the lineup for this game. The San Jose Sharks decided to run an 11 forward, 7 defenseman setup, which was very surprising. Obviously, Eklund had a relatively last-minute injury, but the Sharks managed to call somebody up because they are in San Jose, so they only really have to walk across the street, more or less, and they bring up Ethan Cardwell. So you're thinking he's just going to fill in for Eklund. That'll still be 12 forwards, but instead, with this being the second half of a back-to-back, of course, Michael Misa ends up sitting out, and that confidence thing comes with Michael Misa as well. How can we expect him to build that confidence and really find his game at the NHL level when he is literally sitting out every other game at this point? The Sharks have played 13. He has only participated in 7 of them. And even when he does play, he is given such limited ice time that it's hard to even necessarily criticize him because he's not really being given the space to find his way here in the NHL. And we see what it works out for when you do allow that for Sam Dickinson, and maybe at some point, hopefully, the Sharks will actually allow that with Michael Misa as well. I know, of course, there is the contract situation. Now that Dickinson has played 10 games, that gives the Sharks 50 out of 50 contracts, and so Michael Misa literally cannot play 10 games until the Sharks actually get rid of a player, which they should have already done, but they should do it, the best time to do it was before, but the second best time is as soon as possible here. But right now, I would like to see Misa, and I've said this already so many times, actually string some games here together, because it's hard to imagine a player can find any sort of confidence in themselves whatsoever if they're constantly being brought out of the lineup. And I know yesterday he was not very good against Colorado, and so you could argue that this is a performance-related benching, but at the same time, he's had good games in the past and then still got benched the very next day, and so that doesn't really seem to be all that related. It's just, yet again, where Michael Misa pulled right back out of the lineup and not allowed to really build up any sort of momentum whatsoever. When it comes to the actual players here, to finally arrive at that point, guess I'll have to go through it a little bit quicker. We have the Sharks' top line: Toffoli, Celebrini, and Will Smith. The tragedy here in this game, Macklin Celebrini's point streak does come to an end, but that does not mean that Macklin Celebrini had a bad game. On the other hand, I thought he was once again just doing a ton for the San Jose Sharks. He is that player who is just able to show up here and just absolutely dominate on a pretty consistent basis. He was just making plays happen as he usually does. He is just this incredible player. I mean, I look back at last season with Celebrini, and he was already a very, very good player. And you were kind of left wondering, like, okay, besides cleaning up a couple of things, how can he possibly get better? But now this season, like, he has gotten better, and by even like a pretty good amount. Celebrini just looks that fantastic at this point. But when it comes to his two line mates, I don't want to say that they were necessarily holding him back, but they didn't do him a ton of favors. Will Smith, I was pretty hard on yesterday, who I said I felt as though he just didn't have a particularly great game. I thought he was looking a little bit slow and just not into it. And here tonight, it did kind of continue. Now, of course, he did pick up that fantastic primary assist on the Sam Dickinson goal. That was a great pass, and that's exactly what Will Smith can offer you, because he still has incredible talent with the puck, but it was the off-puck play and just being able to generally keep up that didn't really help out this weekend. Now, over the course of this entire season all around, I do think Will Smith has played pretty well. I mean, if you just go back to the games before this weekend against New Jersey and Los Angeles, he was quite good, so I don't think this is like a long-term issue for this top line, but obviously Smith, you want to see a little bit more consistency from. The real long-term issue, however, does happen with Tyler Toffoli, the other player on this line, and I've brought this up each and every time, and I will continue to do so. Yes, I know the Sharks lines are in like a pretty stable spot at this point, but Toffoli is just not providing much of anything when it comes to these two top players, and with how well Celebrini is currently playing, and with how talented that Will Smith really is, having a third player on this line who can actually complement those two could really end up creating this insanely good top trio, but Toffoli's just not really that guy anymore. I think you would rather have somebody who has a little bit more speed to their game, a little bit more energy to their game, to be able to complement both of these players. Toffoli is basically the exact opposite of that, and at the very least last season he could put the puck in the back of the net and get some great chances. This year, however, not really been the case, with just, I believe, 4 goals across these now 13 games that he has played. That is not the greatest pace thus far for a player who has been a 30-goal scorer in each of these last few seasons, so it's not been a very good start for Tyler Toffoli, and he definitely looks completely like the odd man out on this top line. When it comes to the Sharks' second line, we have Skinner, Wenberg, and Kurashev. So Skinner takes the spot of William Eklund. It is an unfortunate substitution, because not only had the second line been playing very, very well, but Eklund himself has been playing very, very well. And the thing is that Skinner is basically a complete opposite player to Eklund. Eklund is fantastic along the boards. That's the area that he has success in. Skinner, not the case. Let's just say that. And so I was certainly worried that the chemistry of the second line would take a pretty big hit, and it kind of did. I do think individually all three of these players certainly didn't have a bad game. I thought Wenberg was all right. I thought Kurashev was all right. And Skinner, he's managed to score a goal here. That's pretty good. But it just didn't quite come together as like a consistent group like it had in the previous few games. And so hopefully Eklund, I'll just say, is not long-term out here with this injury. It was seemingly like one that came out of nowhere. So maybe it's just like a little maintenance here. Give him the rest. Give him the couple days off before the next game on Wednesday. We'll see what happens. Again, hopefully that's not long-term, because outside of Celebrini, Eklund is probably the biggest injury that the Sharks could possibly have. When it comes to the Sharks' third line, we have Colin Graf with Ty Dellandrea, and they were actually joined by Ethan Cardwell, who gets his first game of this NHL season. He played a few, obviously, last year, but after a fantastic preseason, he was somewhat disappointingly set down, but he finally does get called back up here in Game 13, and I do think that this line was extremely hit or miss. They probably had 3 or 4 shifts where they were incredibly impressive, and Dellandrea had some really strong moments. Cardwell, I thought, looked pretty good at times. Graf, I thought, looked pretty good at times. But outside of those 3 or 4 shifts, it didn't quite end up coming together. It's the type of trio that maybe if they had been given a little bit more time together, given a couple more games to find that chemistry, it could end up working out. But I doubt that these 3 players are still on the same line by even just the next game that does happen, because I imagine that Eklund will come back from injury and the Sharks will want to get Michael Misa into the lineup, so I don't even know if Cardwell will manage to maintain this spot. We shall see. But perhaps an interesting grouping, at least once until Gaudette comes back, could be Graf, Misa, and Cardwell. That could be fun to watch, but again, I'm not sure if we'll end up seeing it. And then when it comes to the Sharks' fourth line, it is not really a fourth line because it's only two players. We have Goodrow and Giles. They frequently found themselves playing with either Macklin Celebrini, who was double shifting, or Alex Wenberg, who was double shifting, which is one of the reasons that I really don't like the 11-7 setup. I feel as though if you're forced into it, it's fine, like if you have no other option, but the Sharks clearly had another option and they decide to go with this anyway. And what ends up happening is that you overplay a couple of players, and as we saw, Alex Wenberg over 26 minutes of ice time, even with as much hockey as the Sharks have played recently. Macklin Celebrini had over 24 minutes of ice time. Now, it worked out in the sense that I think both Barclay Goodrow and Patrick Giles actually had pretty good games playing with these very good players, but it also kind of ruins the flow of your lines. For instance, if you send out your first line, then your second, then your third, and then you want to send out your fourth, but you have Macklin Celebrini double shift with them, well, then you can't go back to your first right away because Celebrini was just on the ice. And so it ruins that kind of sequencing, I would say. But as I mentioned, I thought Giles had a pretty good game here tonight, picks up the secondary assist on the Dickinson goal, and I thought Goodrow had some very, very strong shifts in this one as well. So pretty good for them, benefited from playing with some much better talent than they are used to. When it comes to the Sharks defensively, we have the top pairing. It is Orlov and Liljegren. So the big surprise, I guess, here was that Liljegren actually ended up playing tonight, as yesterday he left the game as a puck hit him on the bench and caused him to leave instantly, didn't come back for the rest of the game. So I thought not necessarily that this would be long-term, but at least it would be, long enough that we wouldn't see him the very next day, and yet here he is. But perhaps it would have been better for him to actually sit out, because Liljegren was not good here tonight whatsoever. He was definitely the Sharks' worst defenseman by a pretty significant margin. He was on the ice for both of these goals against, and that's not necessarily always a notable thing, because it's not as though that means that he was directly the problem, but on these two he kinda was, as he screened Nedeljkovic on both of them. At least one time he was both times I guess you could say, he's kind of trying to box out a Detroit Red Wings player, but at a point you kind of have to clear the way and let your goaltender see it, because both of these shots beat Nedeljkovic clean because he's trying to look around his own teammate in front. So that was not very good. And even outside of those, a lot of mistakes being made from Liljegren. So probably one of his worst games of the entire season. When it comes to his defensive partner, Dmitry Orlov, I do think Orlov was better than Liljegren and was kind of held back by him a little bit, but still not the greatest night for number 9. When it comes to the Sharks' second defensive pairing, we have Ferraro and Klingberg. Klingberg, I'll mention here, the big thing continues to remain the Sharks' power play woes ever since Klingberg had returned from injury. I mean, it just seems so simple, the solution to this problem right now. It's basically like looking at 1+1 and Warsofsky keeps answering with the number 3. The Sharks' power play was looking so well on their 4-game road trip. It was scoring in almost every single one of those games, a couple times even against the Minnesota Wild, and then the moment that Klingberg returns and they put him right back to the top power play unit inexplicably, the Sharks have now been 0 for 12 in their last few power plays. As I mentioned in the previous game, it's not as though Klingberg is fully to blame for this, but if you're wanting to find something that's wrong, if you're trying to find that loose screw, well, you only have to look at the literal one change that you made since the time that the power play got worse. And considering Orlov, he picks up another assist in this game, he's now at 10, and his power play performances, even on that second unit, are still looking pretty solid. You would think the swap would be the easiest possible thing to do, but it's maybe a sense of stubbornness from Ryan Warsofsky because he came into this season with the idea that Klingberg would be their number 1 power play guy, that he is just feeling like that is 100% necessary to keep up. But sometimes you have to adapt, and Orlov had clearly been working very well in that role, so I don't know why they don't just make the quick swap, have Orlov be on that top unit, put Klingberg on the second, and that's that. I've seen the obvious possibility of, they're just trying to inflate John Klingberg's value, but I highly doubt that Mike Greer is coming down from the press box and saying, you need to play Klingberg on this top power play unit so we can try to sneak out an extra draft pick at the trade deadline. I feel as though Warsofsky, he has a good amount of power here as the head coach of deciding what to do, and he's probably not all that worried about getting a better draft pick, considering any draft pick that they might get from Klingberg probably doesn't pan out for a few years, and who's to say that Warsofsky would even still be here as the head coach in a few years? here, considering the usual shelf life for head coaches in the NHL, and so he should be more so worried about trying to win games, and right now Klingberg on the top unit is not winning games. When it comes to Klingberg's actual performance here tonight, good news, wasn't the worst defenseman, because obviously Timothy Liljegren does get that title, and I think while there were mistakes, he wasn't making necessarily more mistakes than many of the other Sharks defensemen here tonight. The problem that I had with Klingberg in this game is that the big thing about this defenseman, the only reason you would actually want him in the lineup is for him to contribute offensively, and I already mentioned the power play is doing absolutely nothing, but even at even strength, there wasn't a ton doing for him this game. Now, last game, I had praised him for his ability to move the puck and actually just skate with the puck. That is something that he still actually has an ability to do, but it did not show up here tonight. And if you're not going to perform offensively, then what exactly is Klingberg actually offering in the lineup? We already know that this season, he has not been good defensively. We know historically over the past few seasons, he has been absolutely horrible defensively. And so, again, your only reason for having him here is offense, and he's not really contributing that so far. When it comes to his defensive partner, Mario Ferraro, I should note the defensive partners were very much in flux throughout this game because of the fact that the Sharks ran 7 defensemen, another reason why I do not like this setup. But Ferraro, I think, did redeem himself after yesterday's game. He was not good against Colorado, but he was a little bit better here tonight against Detroit, though it's not saying much. And then when it comes to the Sharks' third defensive pairing, the problem I had with both Mukhamadullin and Vincent Desharnais is that they just didn't play enough. For whatever reason, John Klingberg had 22 minutes of ice time, which actually led every single Sharks defenseman here in this game. Meanwhile, Mukhamadullin, who was very good yesterday against Colorado, and I thought still pretty solid here tonight against Detroit, ends up with just 15 minutes. So I'm not sure what that's about. I'm not sure what that spread actually says here, but Mukhamadullin has been playing well. And then when it comes to his defensive partner, Vincent Desharnais, I thought he also looked pretty good. I'm not that upset about the fact that he didn't get more ice time, though he probably could have done with like an extra minute or two, just because I know putting too much on his plate is not a smart move, but he looked pretty decent tonight as well. And then finally, we have Sam Dickinson, who I already obviously talked at length about back at the beginning of this section of the video. A ton of confidence in his game. He played very, very well here tonight. The Sharks' best defenseman. He scores that goal. He even had a very good chance of scoring a goal earlier on in this game off of a great rush. Basically, the only chance that the Sharks had in the entire first period. So it's nice to see. I'm hopeful that this means that Sam Dickinson will not only get more ice time, and the fact that he got an overtime shift could be an indication of that happening, but he'll actually be able to play more games more often as we move forward. But this does bring up a big question with him playing his 10th game and knowing that he will stick around at least for the foreseeable future. The Sharks, when fully healthy, will have 9 NHL defensemen. These 7 that played tonight, and then Nick Leddy, who remains on the sidelines, and Vincent Iorio, who has been scratched for a few games. So the big question is who ends up getting moved, who ends up getting waived, who ends up getting traded, whatever the case may be. Traded is actually maybe the most likely scenario, considering the Sharks do still have to create contract space for Michael Misa, assuming he will also end up playing 10 games this season. Ferraro and Liljegren could be candidates there. If someone is going to get waived, there's no guarantee that they would get picked up, and in fact I would bet that neither Klingberg or Leddy would get picked up if they were to get waived, which I highly doubt considering Warsofsky's treatment of both of these players, but a decision does have to be made. I would say the most likely situation again is a trade, but if it was going to be someone waived, probably Iorio. He's been scratched for these last few games, and this is a way kind of to guarantee sort of that you'll end up getting rid of a contract, because if you do waive him, the Washington Capitals have the ability to pick him up and get him into the AHL for free, and so they would absolutely do that. So that does get rid of a player, but it's a little bit awkward to waive a player who you just picked up, so we'll see what ends up happening. And then finally we have the Sharks goaltender Nedeljkovic, who I do think put up a really good game. He was perhaps the Sharks best player of the night, certainly kept them alive, made some big saves, and allowed the Sharks to end up getting to this point in the shootout to claim that extra point, or to claim the 1 point, I should say. And now the Sharks are in a very interesting position, because back at the beginning of this season, it felt as though neither of these goaltenders were a good choice to actually start, but recently, both are actually looking pretty good. Nedeljkovic had the great game tonight, as well as the one against the New Jersey Devils. Then you go back to Askarov, who was very good yesterday against Colorado. Yes, he had that maybe a bit off game against the Los Angeles Kings, but then he was quite good against the Wild and very good against the Devils. So both goaltenders have been playing a lot better as of late. And so now you're in the interesting situation of who actually gets more starts than the other one. This is really where the Sharks wanted to find themselves, so it's not a bad situation by any means. We'll see what Warsofsky does decide. But that will do it for this review. The Sharks will be back in action on Wednesday, where they'll be taking on the Seattle Kraken. This was a team that that was only just barely above the San Jose Sharks in the standings. Well, points-wise, they were a decent bit above, but in the standings-wise Pacific Division, they were only 7th to the San Jose Sharks 8th, and it was expected that Seattle would remain in a pretty similar spot this year, but they have also had a very strong start to this season, so the stretch of games here that the Sharks are playing against really, really good teams, it does kind of continue moving into that next one. Class dismissed.